tell you the story of this print, which is called Rachel and the Banana Quit. It's part of a body of work called Flamingo in the Dark that I did in the 70s. I was working with a process called Kwikprint, which I always said was quick with a K, not with a Q, because it wasn't fast at all. It was a commercial 4-color process proofing system that probably was invented before World War II for proofing color separation negatives. And I began to use it in the early 70s, actually the mid-70s, as an alternative to gum bichromate printing. It was a whole lot easier because I applied it to a plastic sheet, which is what this image is on. It's a sheet of vinyl. It involved using large contact negatives, really large ones. So for this image, there was this one and the background image. So this is a relatively simple image because there were only 2 negatives involved. But there were many applications of color. So I would expose the background image, and in this case, that's the bluebird and some of the other embroidery from the bluebird image, and then expose the figure with several layers of color. And that was done by applying color with a cotton pad, the Kwikprint with a cotton pad, buffing it till it was dry, laying the negative in register on the sheet, exposing it with extreme ultraviolet light, either outdoors or inside with an ultraviolet light unit, lifting off the negative, taking it to the sink and hosing off the unexposed pigment. I would then scrub it with Ajax and a sponge to give it a very sort of painterly look as opposed to a really flat look like you would get with a screen print, for example. And then more and more color applications were made. So this is how the image Rachel in the Banana Quit was made. The image Rachel in the Banana Quit eventually found a home in this book called Flamingo in the Dark. And the book originally looked just like this. The Dust Jacket was a later edition. It was done in the 80s, once I had moved to Illinois. The book itself was published in Rochester, New York. Flamingo in the Dark is quite a lavish hard-colored book. It has end sheets that are printed, and they have a deckled edge, which I thought was like the feather of a flamingo. And then inside is the explanation for the name of the book. It's a crayon drawing that I did when I was a little girl, probably in about 2nd grade, called Flamingo in the Dark. And my grandmother had saved it for all those years, and after she passed away and I was given the drawing, a lot of the imagery that I still do is already here. Things like water, reflections, birds, Florida imagery. So I decided to name this book Flamingo in the Dark because it's a visual autobiography that starts with my childhood in Florida, and the first image is called Wedding Dream. That's me as a little girl thinking about getting married. You see me as a young girl, and eventually as an adult, and a woman as a full moon, so this is alluding to fertility. Eventually there's an image that's a favorite of mine called Bird's Nest, a picture of me sort of looking down at this nest with eggs in it, and there's a clock instead of the moon. And I put this together very intuitively, and it was later, after I exhibited it, that someone said, oh, it's a woman and her biological clock thinking about nesting. And of course that's exactly what was happening, but I wasn't consciously putting it together, saying, oh, this will stand for this or this will stand for that. It was just, I was very much in tune with what was going on subconsciously. The book came along after the fact. The images were made as unique images, and I would work on them sometimes for a week or so. building up the colors, as I mentioned, over time. Sometimes I would work 2 or 3 images at the same time, resolving them sort of the way you would resolve a painting. You sit back and look and think about what you're going to do next. I had a fairly large body of these images, and then I got the National Endowment grant, Fellowship in Photography, and I knew I could afford a book. So I decided I would sequence these images and put them together. And the most obvious, and I think the easiest way to sequence them was in a semi-chronological narrative, starting with me as a little girl and ending with my daughter and the birth of my daughter. So it goes through all the phases of a woman's life from childhood. There's some teenage images in here. And then eventually my marriage and pregnancy and the birth of my child. So my first child, I have a second child too, I have a son. And this is where Rachel and the Banana Quit appears in the book. It's the second to the last image. And the last image is a small Polaroid of Rachel in the bathtub and a little note that says, "Bea Nettles fishes for meaning, so let's sing her a song." That was left behind at an exhibition of my prints in the early 70s, and I hung on to it for a long time because I liked that sort of viewer response, and so I thought that was a good way to end the book.